Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Sheldon Chambers and I will be your host this evening. Today we will be speaking to Olaf Stando. He is an SNP activist and was the former digital marketing officer for the SNP. But first, let's go through the Ukraine update. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky has followed to Washington, D.C. in an attempt to rescue a critical 61 billion military aid package, while separately the UK hinted that it may increase the value of the arms, ammunition and training that it donates to Kiev. Zelensky is due to meet President Biden as well as US senators and the Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson at a time when Congress is holding up future American financial support for Kiev's war efforts. Shortly after arriving in the US capital, Zelensky said Ukraine was counting on the US and that delays to the future round of military aid were dreams come true for Vladimir Putin. Putin must lose, Zelensky said in a speech at the National Defense University. You can count on Ukraine, and we hope just as much to be able to count on you. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who introduced the Ukrainian president, said America's commitment to Ukraine was unshakable and supporting the war was critical to ensure the security of the US and its allies. The International Monetary Fund's Executive Board, IMF, on Monday approved a $9 million disbursement for Ukraine and its $15.6 billion loan program, hours before IMF chief Kristalina Georgieva met Zelensky. Alexei Navalny, the jailed Russian opposition leader, has not been heard from for nearly a week and his lawyers have been unable to contact him, his supporters have said. A decision to start talks on Ukraine's EU accession is on a knife edge after Hungary said it would not bow to mounting pressures to give the green light. Viktor Orban's threat to veto the launch of negotiations is being taken seriously, with Ukrainian's foreign minister warning of devastating consequences for his country if the talks are blocked. Russian forces have unleashed a major offensive on Avdiivka, with 610 artillery strikes reported near the eastern Ukrainian town over the past day, according to the Ukrainian military. Hi. So, are you there?
I'm there, yeah.
Hi, sorry. Cool. So, I was just wondering, with the American support waning, can Europe maintain its current support of Ukraine?
I think it's quite concerning, isn't it? The reports emerging from the Republican side of the Congress blocking essential aid to Ukraine, which has been ensuring that Ukraine can make decent progress against the Russian invaders. The US aid is completely instrumental and fundamental to Ukraine keeping the line, and hopefully they will turn around and see sense in supporting Ukraine, because supporting Ukraine is not just about Ukraine itself. It's about protecting our Western democratic values. It's about ensuring that we don't let tyrants like Putin set the world order. And it's about protecting everything that we stand for, liberal democracy, freedom. And that's what Zelensky's Ukraine represents and very heroically defends day in, day out. So, let's hope that the Western support for Ukraine doesn't fade. I think it's really important. On a note of conciliatory start, what the UK government is doing, the UK government is trying to basically stand up for Ukraine and say to the West, look, you've got to protect these guys because they're facing a very perilous situation otherwise. So it's worrying to see what's happening in the US, but hopefully they'll see sense.
Do you see there being a domino effect if America decides that it's going to no longer support Ukraine financially?
I think so. I mean, you've seen that already in Europe, even before the US deadlock on this. So obviously, Viktor Orban has been quite a pro-Putin leader. He just called Ukraine, I think, the most corrupt, or he called Zelensky the most corrupt leader, and Orban has always been siding with Putin over this. But you also have leaders like, Marine Le Pen, who might win the French presidential election next year, which would obviously be a horrible thing. You have people like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, who has just won the election the other week. He's had historically quite pro-Putin views. So I think as the far right in Europe surges, so does the threat of support for Ukraine fading away. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that doesn't come to pass, but it's definitely a scary prospect.
Thank you. We're going to turn to Israel and Gaza now. Palestinians who have been injured during the war in Gaza are facing potential fatal delays, both in getting treatment within the coastal strip as well as in being evacuated abroad, caused by Israeli bureaucracy and military checkpoints. The UN and aid organisations say the delay comes amid the claim by the World Health Organization that Palestinian ambulance staff involved in a recent high-risk evacuation were detained at gunpoint. Stripped and beaten by Israeli soldiers, an estimated 50,000 Palestinians have been suffered injuries in the last 2 months of Israeli military operations launched after Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October. 18,412 people have been killed, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. The number of Palestinians killed by Israeli forces in occupied West Bank city of Jenin on Tuesday has risen to 4, the Palestinian Health Ministry reported. The Israeli military has confirmed that it fired from drones, killing an unspecified number of Palestinians. It said had been spotted hurling explosive devices and firing at its forces. The UN General Assembly is due to vote on Tuesday on a non-binding resolution demanding an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, a call that the Security Council has so far failed to make after the US vetoed a draft resolution. The UK abstained on the vote. All other 13 members of the Security Council backed the ceasefire call. Israel has continued its bombing of Gaza as fierce fighting raged on Tuesday, with Hamas saying clashes had taken place in central Gaza and witnesses reporting deadly Israeli strikes in the south of the territory. Israel's Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, has said the Israel had no intention of staying permanently in Gaza after completion of its military campaign to eliminate Hamas. The country was open to discussing alternatives about who will control the territory, as long as it is not a group of hostile to Israel, he said. A spokesman for the government of Cyprus says that a team of technical experts from Israel is visiting the island nation to inspect infrastructure and facilities that will be used to ship humanitarian aid across the Mediterranean to Gaza, once conditions on the ground allow for it. The US has warned Houthi rebels that the peace plan for Yemen that was negotiated with Saudi Arabia and handed to the UN peace envoy will fail if attacks on merchant shipping off the coast of Yemen continues. Houthis earlier said that they had carried out a military operation against a Norwegian commercial tanker in the Red Sea. 4 human rights groups have written to the UK government calling for a halt to UK arms sales to Israel in response to the war in Gaza. So over 18,000 people have already been killed in Gaza. That is more than the amount that were killed during the Nakba. So how many more Palestinians need to be killed before Israel acknowledges it is causing a genocide?
I think, look, there's a really big problem in the West's complacency about this issue. I think it's really important to not diminish what happened on October the 7th and to acknowledge the pain still felt by Israel and by Israelis in particular. There's still a lot of people that have families held hostage in Gaza. There's still a lot of people that lost loved ones. And I think it's important to not forget this. But one act of evil, which was Hamas's murderous terrorist attack on October the 7th, does not justify an act of ethnic cleansing, collective punishment, bombing hospitals, detaining hospital staff, detaining staff from WHO and the Red Crescent. And that's sadly what the Israeli army is doing. And the West, for the sake of its support for Israel, is completely ignoring what is happening in Gaza. And that is shameful. And that is just not acceptable. So I think it's good to see the increasing criticism from the US For example, I think just today, Biden was saying that the international support for Israeli action is diminishing if Israel stays this course. I think you've had, really encouraging signs from the start of the Irish government and the Scottish government and the Spanish government all urging restraint and putting this into much needed context. So I think, the longer Netanyahu behaves like he does, let's be honest, like a war criminal, and the longer people like Yoav Gallant, who's in charge of Israelis' defense, the same guy who called Palestinians human animals, let's not forget, shortly after October the 7th, the longer they continue in this inhumane way, the less international support Israel is going to get. But to be honest, people trapped in Gaza right now, the world's biggest open-air prison, cannot wait a day longer for the international community to get their act together. I think what we need is a frank, genuine discussion on the EU level on how to ensure that the ceasefire negotiation starts again, on how to ensure that the settlers in the West Bank are not running rampant and attacking Palestinians in their daily lives and stealing more land, and how to make sure that this is finally brought to an end, because this conflict is neither benefiting Palestinians. I think what Hamas has been doing and the terrorist attack unleashed is not leading to Palestinian freedom. But what Israel is doing is definitely not leading to Israeli security. It's actually diminishing Israel's security in the long term. So I think you need to have some adults in the room basically starting a serious and honest conversation about how to resolve this. And we're lacking that at the moment.
Thank you. So do you think the UK is doing enough right now to push for humanitarian aid in Gaza?
No. I think, the UK often likes to boast about having, one of the biggest international aid budgets. Of course, it's the same Tory government that slashed its aid budget from 0.7 to 0.5. And, it's all well and good giving money and giving aid to an area, but if people can't leave the biggest open-air prison in the world, and when people are being bombed relentlessly every single day, including in hospitals and UN schools, it's just not good enough. I think the UK has a moral obligation, especially to the people of Gaza and people of Palestine. Obviously, Britain has ruled over mandatory Palestine for decades, and Britain has led on things like the Balfour Declaration, which led to the establishment of Israel. So I think Britain has particularly strong moral imperative to be a stronger player in trying to resolve this. I think Britain is not really being strong enough in saying to Israel, look, of course, you've got the right to defend yourself, but you've got to do that with international law. You've got to ensure that civilians are not being hurt. You've got to ensure that hospitals are being protected. At the moment, none of that is really happening. So yeah, I think the UK government has to step up, but so does every single government in Europe, apart from a few noble exceptions.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn to COP28 now. The UK minister in charge of COP28 climate talks has been returning to London, leaving civil servants to finish the tough negotiations in his absence. Graham Stewart, the Minister of State for Climate Change, left Dubai on Tuesday morning to return to his duties as an MP. The government confirmed even as the climate talks reached a crisis point. The departure by the head of delegations for the leading developed countries was met with shock and disbelief from campaigners and other delegations at the talks. The fortnight-long talks have reached a crisis after a draft deal by the host country, United Arab Emirates, was rejected by scores of developed and developing countries, governments, including the UK. Although the text called for a reduction in production and consumption of fossil fuels, it contained no obligation for countries to make such cuts, instead framing it as one of a list of options that countries could undertake. No end to negotiations is yet in sight, as countries are locked in disagreement over whether to phase out or phase down fossil fuels. The UK strongly rejected the text and was tabled by the presidency on Monday evening in Dubai, with Stewart visiting the UAE presidency to demand a toughening up of the text. The UK says it wants a full phase out of fossil fuels to be agreed at these talks. However, critics have pointed out that the UK is also planning a new round of oil and gas licenses in the North Sea. Rishi Sunak attended the talks briefly in their opening days, but was criticised for staying for less time talking to other leaders than he spent on the private jet that carried him to and from the conference. The decision to hold COP29 climate talks in Azerbaijan has upset Armenia, coming just months after the Armenia described as ethnic cleansing of tens of thousands of Armenians from the Nagorno-Karabakh enclave. In September, an estimated 120,000 Armenians fled the Nagorno-Karabakh, known to Armenians as the Artsakh, after Azerbaijan military launched an anti-terrorist campaign on the region, which had been run by a local ethnic Armenian government. Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has alleged the Armenian exodus amounted to a direct act of ethnic cleansing and depriving people of their motherland. Azerbaijan has since pledged to respect the rights of the ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, but the Armenians said the decision to hold the next UN climate talks in the country has effectively barred them from attending. So why does it matter that the climate policies at COP28 has been watered down, and what are the impacts this is going to have on the Scottish people?
I think firstly, can we just let that sink in that Rishi Sunak literally spent more time on a private plane to COP28 instead of talking to leaders about how to solve the biggest crisis of our time, the climate crisis. I think that says everything you need to know, and not just him coming for a mere few hours to Dubai, but also David Cameron and King Charles all flying in separate private jets. I think that really paints a picture, doesn't it, of COP increasingly being just a space for leaders to mingle in. A huge amount of lobbyists, of course, from the oil and gas sector. I think some of the oil and gas delegations were bigger than national delegations of developing countries. And I think it is easy to be cynical about how much politicians actually care about the climate crisis when you see scenes like that. I think the very fact that it was hosted in Dubai, where the COP president is also a chairman of a national oil company, the very fact that the next COP is happening in Azerbaijan, a country that has just invaded an enclave and was accused of ethnic cleansing, and of course also built its fortune on fossil fuels. I think all of that shows that we have actually gone backwards since COP in Paris. You know, the Paris Agreement that was a groundbreaker in committing countries to keep to 1.5 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels, that's fading away, that's slipping away, and that's really, really concerning. I mean, I had quite a lot of hope actually after COP26 in Glasgow when, again, to their credit, the UK was pushing very strong on phasing down coal and fossil fuels, and the Scottish government obviously led with its loss and damage funding commitments. I think we've gone backwards in many respects since then. And again, it's not great to see that the UK, which was boasting at COP26 of being a global leader on climate, isn't even bothering to stay for the whole summit. And Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, wasn't even there for the full day. I think, you know, we really have to get our act together as a global community on this. I know that we've got a trend across Europe of retreating back to our borders and becoming more and more closed-minded and talking about migration and talking about petty little gossip conflicts instead of the biggest issue of our time. But it really is quite depressing seeing islands like the Marshall Islands, for example, effectively saying that inaction at COP and the lack of phasing down fossil fuels, the lack of that commitment, is signing a death warrant to the existence of small island nations like ours. And yet the global community isn't really caring. We know, it's crystal clear that if we have global warming at 2.5 or 3 degrees, and we're on track for that at the moment, we're nowhere near meeting the 1.5 target as it stands, we know that it's going to be catastrophic. I mean, we're seeing extreme weather events in Scotland and in the UK and across Europe already. It's only going to get worse. And it just reminds me of the scene from, Don't Look Up, the movie, where a giant meteor is hurtling towards the Earth, but instead we're just focusing on distractions. We're in the Don't Look Up era of politics, and we really have to wake up urgently. And I think countries like the UK, countries that have contributed the most to emissions historically for the Industrial Revolution and for decades of emitting dirty emissions, have the biggest moral imperative to act and provide leadership.
Thank you. We're going to turn to the former Tory peer Michelle Mone's charge of criminal bribery allegations. The former Conservative peer Michelle Money is facing a criminal allegation of bribery as a part of a long-running investigation by the National Crime Agency into her involvement with a company that secured multi-million-pound government PPE contracts from the from the government. In a film paid for by the company PPE MedPro, the producer and presenter Mark William Thomas states that the three criminal allegations that are being made against Moni and her husband Douglas Barrowman as a part of the NCA investigation. The NCA investigation into them both is in relation to allegations of conspiracy to defraud, fraud by false representation, and bribery, which they both categorically deny. Thomas states, he says that he has been given complete access to the couple's criminal case files. Moni and Barrowman, a tax planning and wealth advisory businessman based in the Isle of Man, have both been interviewed under caution by the NCA. Documents shown in the film appear to suggest. The documents, which are heavily cropped in the film released on YouTube on Sunday, include what appear to be prepared statements by Moni and Barrowman for the NCA interviews. One document refers to the bribery allegations against Moni, although the sentence is only partially visible. It references her position in the House of Lords and includes the phrase, reward for the improper performance. Moni made the first approach to Ministers Michael Gove and Theodore Agnew on behalf of the PPE MedPro in May 2020, offering to supply PPE through my team in Hong Kong. Within weeks, the government awarded the newly formed company 2 contracts worth a total of £230 million. So this story highlights, I think, a bigger issue around the COVID situation. How much of the problems that we faced during COVID might have been better if we had a more competent government in place?
You know, it's not just about COVID. It goes back a lot more than that. Michelle Mone is basically a martyr of unfettered capitalism, where you have, you know, companies and individuals with dubious experience. I mean, she never had any major experience in delivering PPE, getting contracts just because they know some mates in the government. I think this is actually scandalous, right? I mean, we're talking about millions and billions of public money being literally wasted down the drain on PPE that didn't work. It literally caused excessive deaths during the pandemic. But it speaks to this culture of greed is good, right? Which has been cultivated not just by the Tories, but by the neoliberal capitalist world order, which basically suggests that you're not going to only make money based on merit, how good you are, but who you know. And I think Michelle Mone is really a symptom of that. I think, and it's just it's that spectacle of her feeling sorry for herself, isn't it? Like she was the Saint Michelle Mone trying to save us all, and the Tory party didn't do enough to protect her. And now I think she said something that she's ashamed of being a Tory peer, not because the Tories messed up the COVID response, not because the Tories have cut public services during austerity, not because the Tories have decimated a public realm. She's ashamed to be a Tory peer because the Tories didn't do enough to protect her and her empire of greed. So I think it's really a sad spectacle, but it also tells something about the Westminster media that, frankly, there's been so much focus on an iPad of a Scottish minister. I mean, a bill of £11,000. Of course, it's not ideal, and it's right that Michael Matheson paid back the money, and it's right that Michael Matheson apologised for footing the taxpayer with that £11,000 bill, which he has repaid. And there's been so much frenzy and focus on that, and there's been so little, relatively, about Michelle Mone, who has only made her fortune and literally bought a yacht thanks to her connection and not her expertise in producing PPE, and defrauded, because it is fraud, let's call it what it is, defrauded the taxpayer of hundreds of millions of pounds in the process. And somehow the media are just keeping still about this.
Thank you. We're going to turn now to the sad story of an asylum seeker who was reported dead on the BB Stockholm barge as the Westminster debates Rwanda. While Rishi Sunak was meeting the right-wing rebels from his party this morning to discuss the Rwanda bill, the news broke of the death of an asylum seeker on the BB Stockholm barge. The man is believed to have taken his own life. Police said that they were investigating the sudden death of a resident on the giant vessel in Portland, Dorset, which was released by the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman to house recent arrivals to the UK. A fellow asylum seeker on the barge told reporters that the death was predictable because of the poor conditions on the barge. This death has not come as a surprise to any of us. People taking their lives is a predictable result of the Home Office's policy of putting people on the barge. Sources are reported as saying that there were increasing tensions on the vessel as more asylum seekers were moved on board. Officials are examining a specific incident involving people from the barge in Weymouth on Saturday night that may be related to the death. A Dorset police spokesperson said at 6:22 a.m. on Tuesday, the 12th of December 2023, Dorset police received a report of a sudden death of a resident on the BB Stockholm. Officers are conducting inquiries into the circumstances of the incident. The coroner's office has been notified of the death. In the House of Commons, Home Secretary James Cleverly told MPs that the death would be investigated fully. There are understood to be about 300 male asylum seekers on the barge, which the Home Office claims has the capacity for 500. Up to 4 people are expected to share in each cabin. Charities have consistently warned that residents' mental health was deteriorating while they were on board, with the distress exacerbated by the barge's isolated location. Enver Solman, the chief executive of the Refugee Council, called for an independent review of the incident. He said, "We know from our work supporting men and women and children in the asylum system that many are feeling deeply traumatized and feel isolated and unable to get the help they need. Some are so desperate they self-harm and feel suicidal. It is imperative that the independent review is carried out into his death so that lessons are learned," he said. As we came on air this evening, MPs were getting ready to vote on the Rwanda bill, which is attempting to remove asylum seekers' rights to appeal against being deported to Rwanda. If the results come through while we are on air, we will bring it to you. So, obviously, the Rwanda bill has been brought forward because the Supreme Court ruled that Rwanda isn't a safe country to send asylum seekers. After hearing this story, would you say that the UK is a safe country to keep asylum seekers in?
Picture this. You right now have MPs about to march in the lobbies, either voting for the bill, which is an attempt to break international law in a limited and specific way and undermine the judiciary of this country and heap misery on people that are simply trying to find a better life here and escape persecution, war, conflict, and poverty. Or MPs are voting against this bill, either hardline conservative Tory MPs or Labour MPs, not because the bill is morally not right or because it's inhumane, but because it doesn't go far enough, right? If you listen to a lot of the contributions from the Tory right, or if you listen to a lot of the contributions from the Labour front bench, their argument is not that it's simply inhumane to send people to Rwanda and we shouldn't do it. Their argument is the bill doesn't go far enough and it doesn't deport enough people there, and that's not going to work. There is a massive and shameful lack of moral defence of migration emanating from Westminster, apart from one honourable example, and that's the SNP. And the SNP MPs have consistently made a case for, one, why the Rwanda bill is evil and inhumane and absolutely not just unworkable, but deeply immoral. And, you know, Plaid Cymru MPs and the Green MP Caroline Lucas as well have taken a humane stance on this. But generally, there's been a huge gaping hole in morality. And frankly, it's a failure to our humanity. The way that this debate is conducted, the toxicity, the sheer poison of a debate would make Enoch Powell or Nigel Farage blush while watching this. You know, you've had people like... So
Okay.
the bill just passed.
Okay, yeah. Breaking news. So, breaking news, the Rwanda bill has just passed to its second reading with 313 ayes and 269 noes.
Right, so that's obviously a much smaller rebellion than a lot of people expected. There was potential chat of the bill failing at second reading. I suppose the reason why it passed is because the Tory government said that they'll amend the bill further, essentially to meet the demands of the Tory hardliners, the headbangers that are now calling the shots in government, the likes of Robert Jenrick and Suella Braverman and Steve Baker and the like. And I think this is not the end of it. It's quite clear that what the Tory government is doing by passing this at second reading, they're just deferring the conflict to January. Because what we're going to have now is we're going to have a situation where the House of Lords is trying to water down the bill, rightly, by saying this does not respect international law. This goes against our constitutional demands to respect the law of the judiciary. And you're going to have the Tory right trying to extract more and more concessions from Rishi Sunak. And it's just not going to work. But again, I go back to the fundamental point, which is the idea of sending asylum seekers, people that come here fleeing war, conflict, persecution, poverty, to Rwanda, a country that has a track record in sending asylum seekers back to their countries. Israel has had a scheme with Rwanda. They've had a very similar deal. And it's been found that many of the people that were sent by Israel to Rwanda have been sent back to their countries of origin, which is illegal under international law and which obviously risks their safety and well-being. There is nobody talking about how immoral this is. I mean, we've reached a point where it is now mainstream in British politics because both Tories and Labour agree on this, that sending asylum seekers to a country in Central Africa is okay. And the only conflict is whether it works or it doesn't work. It is absolutely callous. It's toxic. It's not in Scotland's name. It's great to see the honourable exception of the SNP MPs standing up for the benefits of migration and the Scottish Government standing up for migration as being an inherently good thing. But this actually illustrates why we desperately need independence, because we will never have a just and fair and humane system under this Westminster broken poison system that we've got right now.
Thank you. We're going to turn now to the subsea cable that will be taking renewable power from Scotland to England. One of the UK's biggest power grid projects has been awarded a contract worth 1.8 billion for 119 kilometres subsea electricity superhighway to supply renewable power to the north of England from Scotland. National Grid and the Scottish Power plan to begin building the 2.5 billion high voltage power line along the east coast of the country from East Lothian to County Durham from 2025. The Eastern Green Link 1 has been designed to carry enough clean electricity generated in Scotland to power the equivalent of 2 million households south of the border. The UK is under pressure to deliver a power grid overhaul as it prepares to double its demands for electricity by 2040 as part of a plan to cut the use of gas and other fossil fuels. The International Energy Agency has forecast that 600,000 kilometres of electricity line will be need to be either added or upgraded across the UK by the end of the next decade to meet its climate targets, amid a global race to secure supplies of high-voltage cabling and other electrical infrastructure components. The EGL1 project has awarded Prismium Group, an international cable maker, and the contract to deliver nearly 400 kilometres of power cable. The contract to supply 2 HVDC converter stations, one at each end of the cable, has been awarded to GE Vernova and Metilneos. The upgrades are expected to cost tens of billions of pounds, according to the National Grid. The FTS 100 energy company has warned that 5 times as many pylons and underground lines need to be constructed by the end of the decade than in the past 30 years, and 4 times more undersea cables laid than there are at present. The UK's power grid upgrades are likely to become an important battleground in the next UK general election. So, Scotland produces a lot of the UK's renewable energies. How much would you say Scotland is combating the policies of Rishi Sunak with the new oil and gas licenses?
Well, Scotland has got the energy, but it doesn't have the power, right? So, as we often say, Scotland is a renewable powerhouse. It's got a huge amount of potential. But of course, Scotland is being burdened with the highest transmission charges in the whole of the UK. So, renewable generators in Scotland get charged a lot more than generators in England, for example. Indeed, a lot of the renewable electricity generators in Europe, in mainland Europe, countries like Germany, Poland, Norway, etc., are not being charged anything because their governments are incentivizing renewable production. Whereas in Scotland, you have this disproportionate system where essentially, you know, you're being charged a lot to put the energy into the grid once you produce it. And that's obviously being passed on to consumers, meaning that our bills are extortionately high. So the fundamental energy system has to be reformed, and the transmission charges issue has to be looked at quite urgently. But I think, developments like this, massive investments like this, show just how massive Scotland's potential is. And now the big question that we've got to ask ourselves is, who does the wealth actually go to? And whether these big investments in the infrastructure translate to lower prices for consumers, right? Because I think people will be rightly concerned if their bills are going up again, as Ofgem has announced, they're going up again in January. And yet we've got all this investment in renewables and we've got all this energy bounty. So I think it's really important to look at the fundamental issues of ownership, of how do we make sure that we benefit communities in Scotland and not just shareholders of big companies. And it's welcome news. It's another sign of Scotland's big economic strength, and I'm pretty sure that we could do more with it under independence.
Thank you very much. The UK pay growth drops sharply as job vacancies fall. Pay growth is falling sharply and mortgage distress increases amid fresh signs of the impact of higher interest rates on the UK's labour and housing markets. With the economy stagnating, the Office for National Statistics said a marked decline in earning growth in the 3 months to October had coincided with jobs becoming harder to find. In its latest health checks on the labour market, the ONS said growth in total average earnings had dropped from 8% to 7.2% in the 3 months to October, a much bigger drop than the financial market had been predicting. Meanwhile, the number of job vacancies continued to fall, declining by 45,000 to 949,000 in the September to November period. The Bank of England, which will announce its latest interest rate decisions on Thursday, released separate figures showing the value of outstanding mortgage balance in arrears reached 18.8 billion in the third quarter, up 11.4% from the second quarter and by 44% on the year. While the number of mortgages in arrears is still relatively small, the bank said the percentage had risen from 1.2% to 1.14% in the latest quarter, and was now at its highest level since the spring of 2017. The level at which pay is increasing is being closely monitored by the bank's policymakers to gauge inflationary pressures in the economy, and the latest figures will ease fears at the Bank of England of wage price spirals. Financial markets are expecting the bank's 9-strong monetary policy committee to leave official borrowing costs at 5.25% this week. Interests were raised 14 times in succession between December 2021 and August 2023. According to the ONS, total pay in the private sector was 7.2% higher in the 3 months to October than in the same period a year earlier. Public sector pay grew by 7.1%. Regular pay, which strips out the effects of bonuses, rose by 7.3% in the private sector and by 6.9% in the public sector. What is the Scottish Government doing to help people with the rising mortgage costs?
I think what the Scottish Government is doing, firstly, is scrapping, and they've done that a couple of years ago, scrapping the Help to Buy policy, which is actually a really impactful thing because Scotland builds more affordable houses than anywhere else in the UK. Scotland's got relatively the lowest house prices as well, and the most affordable housing market. Rents are also relatively lower in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. Of course, a lot needs to be fixed. We've got rent controls coming down the tracks as well. We've got more support for people to buy their first home. So I think, it's really important that housing is at the top of the agenda. It's an absolutely huge drain on people's cost of living. It's a massive issue. I feel like there's been this lack of a joint housing strategy from the UK government. And obviously, Liz Truss's mini budget, which is over a year old now, a nuclear bomb on the economy, did not help with the rising mortgages, which has actually put a lot of people in real misery. I mean, the amount of repossessions that we've had on houses, the amount of people falling into really bad debts, the amount of people struggling to heat or eat who were previously comfortable just because of Liz Truss's disastrous mini budget is actually quite large, quite astonishing. So, yeah, I mean, and all of this has a real kind of tragic human impact. So I think it was last week that the End Child Poverty Coalition has released statistics that showed that between 2012 and 2019, the UK has had the biggest rise in child poverty out of the world's 39 richest countries. You've got, I think, 87,000 children in Scotland being impacted by the two-child limit, the two-child cap, which is imposed by Westminster. In contrast, you've got the Scottish Government introducing things like the Scottish Child Payment, which are estimated to lift about 90,000 people out of poverty. You've got things like, free tuition and building affordable homes. You've had the eviction ban and the rent freeze recently introduced by the Scottish Government, still going on until the end of March next year. And obviously the system of rent controls coming down the tracks in the housing bill. So I think the Scottish Government is doing what it can, even though it's got one hand tied behind its back. But there's a clear, human effect of the 13 years of austerity and the huge poverty that was unleashed on the people of Britain. And Scotland is just trying to mitigate it at its best. But, again, I go back to the point about independence. If we were independent, and you only have to read the Scottish Government's paper on social justice that was released last week, I think, on what social security would look like in independent Scotland. I think only with independence we can actually have the powers to transform our economy and build a society that works for people and not for profit.
Thank you. The Sakharov Prize awarded to Mahsa Amini, who died in custody in Iran. The European Parliament has presented the Sakharov Prize posthumously to Mahsa Amini, whose death in the Iranian custody prompted mass protests as her mother hailed her daughter's name as a secret code for freedom. The award is the latest international recognition for the women challenging Iran's hardline theocratic government after the jailed activist Nargiz Mohammadi was given the Nobel Peace Prize. Mahsa Amini's mother, father and brother missed the ceremony at the parliament in Strasbourg after Iranian authorities confiscated their passports and barred them from leaving the country. In a speech read out by the family's lawyer, Mahsa Amini's mother, Mojgan Eftikhari, said they were denied the opportunity to attend in violation of all legal and human standards. She said her daughter's name became a secret code for freedom and spread the dream of liberty from her birthplace, Kurdistan, all over Iran, the Middle East and the world. Her life was taken unjustly. They believed that by taking her life, they will stop her from being and becoming, said the speech read out by the lawyer Salam Nikbahakt. Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Iranian Kurd, died on 16th of September 2022 while being held by Iran's religious police for allegedly breaching the Islamic Republic's strict dress code for women. Her death triggered a huge protest in Iran and a global movement known as Women, Life, Freedom, calling for the end of Muslim cleric-led government in Tehran and its imposition of headscarves on women. Iranian security forces have cracked down on protests domestically, killing hundreds and have executed dozens for allegedly participating in what officials have termed riots. The refusal by Iran's government to let Amini's family attend has caused outrage among the EU lawmakers, who said Tehran was seeking to stifle her supporters. That treatment is another example of what the people of Iran face every day, said Roberta Metsola, the European Parliament President. Two prominent activists living in exile outside Iran, Afsoon Najafi and Masada Shanikar, picked up the award in the name of the broader movement. Najafi's sister died during the anti-government protests that swept Iran in the wake of the Armeni's death. Shahinikar was shot in the eye by the country's security forces. Najafi said that there are many Iranians who are still suffering and tortured by the authorities. The EU has imposed sanctions on scores of Iranian officials over the repression of the demonstrators. Why is it important that we understand the significance of Amani's death?
I mean, look, Mahsa Amini was a hero. She was brutally murdered by the Iranian regime because she threatened the fundamentalist, religious extremist values of that Iranian leadership that's trying to suppress women, that's trying to rule over women, and pretend that misogyny is somewhat an Islamic value. I think it is so inspiring watching the women life freedom movement blossom in a country like Iran, where protesting is dangerous, where a lot of people fear for their life and fear for their freedom, for speaking out. And you have a lot of people now out on the streets or in schools or in public transport refusing to wear the headscarf, refusing to bow down to Iranian authorities, and actually being empowered by Mahsa Amini, who was a genuine hero of modern times. And I think it's quite clear that the women life freedom movement is not just a storm that comes and passes, but is a lasting and powerful and impactful force for change. And of course, it's not easy to change a country like Iran, a country in the firm grip of fundamentalist religious despots, you could say. There is still a lot of oppression towards Iranian women, towards Kurdish women in particular. I think the intersection between the feminist movement and the Kurdish movement is particularly interesting. Of course, let's not forget the Kurdish people are the biggest stateless group anywhere in the world right now, I believe. You've got, I think, 30 or 40 million Kurds living across Iran, across Turkey, across Syria, across Iraq, being denied fundamental rights. So, all credit to Mahsa Amini. And by the way, how shameful is it that Mahsa Amini's mother was denied the visa to travel to Strasbourg to pick up the award? How petty is that from the Iranian government? I mean, this is it clearly shows fear from their side, but all power to them. And it's fantastic to see. It's actually very inspiring to see. And solidarity to the movement.
Thank you. We're going to turn now to Berlin to Paris night train. The first night train from Berlin to Paris in almost a decade pulled into Paris Gare de l'Est at 10:24 a.m. on Tuesday morning, hailed as a milestone moment in the renaissance of cleaner alternatives to air travel in Europe. The maiden journey of the new Berlin link left the German capital at 8:18 p.m. on Monday night, fully booked and carrying the French Transport Minister, Clement Beaune, who had hugged his German counterpart, Volker Wissing, before departing. Beaune emerged in Paris describing his journey as magnificent, he said. It was a good start. It's a symbol we need at the moment because we need positive projects, environmental and European projects. The train was cheered along its route before 6 a.m. in Strasbourg. Local politicians waving French and German and European flags had gathered on the platform as the train passed through. The sleeper service between Berlin and Paris had been called by travellers, local politicians and green campaigners for years. It marked a return to a favour of slow travel and cleaner options after the night trains lost out on the competition from budget airlines and high-speed trains at the beginning of the century, with many sleeper train services closing. The connection will be operated by the French and German national train operators SCNCF and Deutsche Bahn, while the rolling stock will be provided by the Austrian train company OB. whose night jet trains already cross Central Europe. In 2020, the French President Emmanuel Macron said he aimed to open 10 new sleeper services by 2023. The first new sleeper train from Paris to Aurillac in Central Region departed on Sunday night, 20 years after the service was closed. The French government has invested €100 million, £86 million, to retrieve the national network and prepare new carriages for the service. In Germany, Deutsche Bahn aims to expand its night train connection to 13 other large European cities in partnership with the operators. With HS2 now out of service, is the UK falling behind on its green credentials?
Yes, it is. And look, you have a situation where the Spanish government can build hundreds of kilometers of high-speed track every year. You've got a magnificent high-speed line in France where you can get to basically every corner of the country using high-speed services. It takes you, I think, 2 hours from Paris to Bordeaux. It takes you about 2 hours Paris to Lyon and 3 hours to Marseille. And you've got a high-speed rail service in Germany as well. Not to mention countries like China, where high-speed rail is being built pretty much by the month. So I think, HS2 and the abandonment of it after so much money's been poured into the scheme already really says a lot about Britain's problem with productivity and Britain's problem with long-term strategic planning. I could go on. I mean, I'm a big train fan. I'm a big train nerd. Funny enough, I was actually back from France last night. I was on a long weekend trip visiting my sister who lives in Grenoble in the French Alps, and I came all the way by train. I came from Scotland to Grenoble, and then yesterday I went from Grenoble to Paris to London, and London to Edinburgh. And you could see the contrast in the quality and the service that you get between the UK and the continent. To put it in context, the journey from Grenoble to Paris is equivalent, or in distance terms, to the journey between London and Dundee, I think. The journey from Grenoble to Paris took half the time. Okay, in beautiful, high-speed, clean, well-maintained trains, and the train was completely on time as it arrived on the beautiful platforms of Paris, Gare de Lyon. So look, I'm a huge fan of night trains. I think it's really, really positive to see. I think it says a lot about the ambition of the EU to create a more sustainable network with greener alternatives. I think, traveling by night train just creates that special sort of joy, doesn't it? And arriving in a city centre in the morning, without having to go through airport security or travel through faraway airports on buses and trains. I think it's a really cool thing. And obviously, just a couple of months ago, another service has started from Brussels to Berlin. There's more night train connections, I think, from Zurich to Barcelona coming next year. So it's really, really exciting, and I can't wait to get on that train whenever I get a chance.
Brilliant, thank you. We're now going to turn to the narrowing of Scotland's education attainment gap. The proportion of the pupils in primary achieving expected levels of literacy and numeracy have reached record highs for children from both the most and least deprived areas, according to official statistics. Overall, the achievement of the Curriculum for Excellence levels, ACEL 2022-2023 show for numeracy a total of 79.6% of pupils reached the levels expected in 2022 to 2023, a rise of 0.5 percentage points compared to the previous high, 79.1% in 2018 to 19. For literacy, a rise of 72.7% up on the previous high of 72.3% in 2018 to 19. The gap between the proportion of primary pupils from the most and least deprived areas achieving expected levels in literacy has also decreased to the lowest on record in 2022 to 2023. The figures also show improvements at secondary level compared to 2021/2022, with increases in attainment across the board, and the gap between those from the most and least deprived areas has reduced. Commenting, Education Secretary Jenny Gilruth said, "These figures show record levels of attainment across primary school levels and significant improvement in secondary. I congratulate our pupils and teachers for their hard work over the last year." These findings are the most up-to-date statistics on attainment and are comprehensive across all public funded schools in Scotland, demonstrating a clear rise in the standards above pre-pandemic levels among primary school pupils. Along with this year's SQA results, they point to a widespread rise in attainment. I recognise that there is no room for complacency, and our programme for reform across the education and skills systems will help identify where further improvements can be made, and will look to drive enhancing attainment to ensure all young people meet their full potential. There is, from those statistics, there's still at least 20% of primary school students that could increase to expected levels. What is being done to help them achieve those targets, and what extra support is being provided to primary school students who are considered disabled?
Well, firstly, let's not forget that the attainment gap in our schools and our universities and colleges is caused by poverty, right? It's called poverty-related attainment gap for a reason. And I think the Scottish Government is, again, as we mentioned before, doing what it can to tackle poverty. You've got the Scottish Child Payment, which has increased from, £10 originally to £25 in the space of, I think, 18 months. And that's really significant. That's lifting about 90,000 kids out of poverty. You've got programs like, 13 new benefits launched by the Social Security Scotland agency, which was only established, I think, in 2018. And you have, I think, the highest investment in teachers in terms of teacher salaries. Teacher salaries in Scotland are the best in the UK. You've got a record high education budget. All of that comes together to produce this encouraging result. But look, it's really important that the government does not rest on the laurels. Education is by far the best way out of poverty, and it's so important to properly invest in our kids. And we've had slightly worrying PISA results a couple of days ago. I think that's something that the government should take seriously. I work in the education sector. I work with students in colleges and universities, and there's a huge concern about cost of living impacting students' ability to learn. You've also got increasingly more and more pressure on teachers in terms of having to work overtime on assignments. You've had strikes, obviously, that led to more pressure compounding. So there's definitely challenges in the education system, but it's good to see that there's the record levels of numeracy and literacy. And I think really the most important thing to say here is that it's a huge credit to Scotland's teachers who are doing an amazing job in very difficult circumstances.
Thank you very much. Well, that is it for this evening. Before I go, I just want to remind you that the broadcast in Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters, so that everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programme will always be free to view. However, if you can afford 5 months, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our 30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing. Due to the generosity of our supporters, we have raised over £22,000. However, our need to raise the remaining £8,000 is really urgent. Good night, and thank you for watching.